So now we're going to get into our first panel with the 5 leaseholders. But I first want to introduce our esteemed moderator. Many of you know her. She's been one of the biggest advocates for offshore wind and has been instrumental in moving offshore wind forward at a national level. Stephanie McClellan serves as Turn Forward's founder and strategic advisor. She has 12+ years as an offshore wind veteran, having held leadership roles in offshore wind across philanthropy-funded initiatives, industry, and state government. Please join me in welcoming Stephanie and our 5 leaseholders.
Well, good morning. It is a pleasure to be here. This is not the 2nd annual Offshore Wind Conference in California, but it is the 2nd annual Leaseholders panel. And so I was privileged to be here last year with these folks and really pleased to be here again with, I'm going to give everyone an opportunity to introduce themselves, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to just go down the list and give names and serial numbers and ranks. But I'm thrilled to be here with all of these esteemed CEOs of the California leaseholders. And last year when we were here, you guys weren't even, you were provisional leaseholders. You hadn't even signed your leases yet. And we talked a lot about what needs to happen for offshore wind to get launched in California, for offshore wind to succeed. And I know Adam has said it, and Chair Hochschild has said it, but the state has done so much. These companies have done so much this year. Advocates have been working so hard. A lot has been done in a short period of time. And California has really put itself in a position to succeed, but what we really want to get into today is sort of, okay, what's next? What do we need to do now? What's going to be most important to succeed? And so today, that's what we're here to talk about. Before we get into that, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to just give a brief introduction of yourself, and let's just start with, as you're introducing yourself and your project, what have you been up to this year? What are you most excited to share with the audience? So I'm going to start at the end with Dan Runyan from Invenergy.
All right. Thank you so much. My name is Daniel Runyan. I work as the head of the offshore development at Invenergy. I recently joined Invenergy about 3.5 months ago. Just prior to that, I was working mainly facilitating offshore development in Japan. I spent the past 9 years working to develop both onshore and offshore projects there in Japan. Some of it living in Japan, and then a portion of it living in Amsterdam, building up a team that was supporting those projects. And so, you know, super excited to be here, looking forward to continuing that transition of renewable energy here in the United States.
Great. And Martin Goff and Equinor.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Martin Goff. I'm the head of Renewables for the Pacific region for Equinor, where we have responsibility for the Atlas Wind offshore wind lease, which is the westernmost of the 3 central coast lease areas, and hopefully one of many lease areas that we develop over the years here on the Pacific region. I think most people know Equinor and know that we're not new to energy, and we're certainly not new to floating offshore wind either. We've constructed and now operate 2 floating wind farms as part of our global portfolio. We're also not new to the US. We've been here for several decades, and as well as our presence here on the West Coast, we also have a presence in offshore wind on the East Coast, where we're now constructing one of our bottom-fixed wind farms. In terms of the highlights of the year, it has been a very eventful year. I think we started off by one of my key ambitions was to develop a local presence here in the West Coast. We established an office in the Bay Area. That's where I am day to day. And we've built up the local team in the state to 10 people, really forming the part of that core project management team, as well as those really important on-the-ground roles for the local community liaison director, the tribal liaison, and really building up that resource here to develop a pipeline of projects for the future. A really exciting development this year and a highlight is the fact that we now have a survey vessel offshore. So it's out there currently, the Ocean Infinity, collecting data as we speak. So that's been a real achievement to see for the 10 years of business development to finally come to something that looks real. And I think, as you know, that it takes tens of millions of dollars investment to do these types of surveys. And that was really made possible, the confidence to do that, from another highlight, which was AB 1373, that central procurement bill, which gives us the signals, the positive market signals that there is a route to market, and it gives me the confidence to invest in these really critical parts of project development.
Great. Thanks, Martin. Alicia Barton, Vineyard Offshore.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. And I wasn't here for the panel last year when we were provisional leaseholders, as I joined the company in January. And a little bit about Vineyard Offshore, for those of you that don't know us, we are based in the Boston area, and in terms of our California lease, we are one of the Northern California leaseholders. So we're up in the Humboldt area, and that is obviously, a very exciting initiative for our company, and complements the efforts that we're advancing on the East Coast, where we are developing a project off the coast of New York. We have an additional leased area off the coast of New England that we are planning to serve the New England market with, as well as we are underway for construction of the Vineyard Wind 1 project, which is the first very large offshore wind project to go to construction in the United States. It's been a long time coming, a project that many of us have worked on for a very long time, and so it's super exciting to finally see steel in the water, to see the activity in, for example, the New Bedford area, where we are deploying the Vineyard Wind 1 project. And I think it does serve as a bit of a glimpse of hopefully the future for what California can envision. And we've been able to host some delegations from California out to see the project under construction, which I think is always very meaningful to putting reality behind some of the efforts. And I'm reminded that we, have been developing Vineyard Wind for quite a long time, and when we talk about the California efforts, we do have a long road ahead of us, but the actions that we undertake now are the ones that will pave the way for success and for setting up, ultimately construction like what we're seeing on the East Coast today. So I think, one of the things I'm personally excited about that has happened in the California market in the last year was the Federal Department of Transportation grant for the Port of Humboldt. And again, going back to the Vineyard Wind project, we know how powerful it is to have early public investments in port infrastructure that set the stage ultimately for project deployment. So hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. Michael Brown, Ocean Winds.
Excellent. Hi, I'm Michael Brown. I am the CEO of Ocean Winds North America. Normally I get to be the unique accent on the stage, but unfortunately Martin kind of screwed me there and then gave a very eloquent market update. So we're the owner of Golden State Wind. Our update is basically Martin's update, with the exception of the fact that our vessel for surveys is mobilizing in about 6 weeks. But it has been an extremely positive year. I think actually more progress has been made than we anticipated in our business case when we originally presented and acquired the lease, and that really comes through the passing of AB 1373. It provides a huge amount of confidence to developers like ourselves to continue to invest, so a huge thing there. OW overall, we are based in Boston. North America is based in Boston. We have 3 leases, so we have South Coast Wind, which is our flagship first lease, and we'll hopefully be moving to construction within the next, couple of years. We have Blue Point Wind, which is a New York Bight lease, and we have Golden State Wind here in California. So we have a broad portfolio. We just recently increased our exposure, or our shareholding in South Coast Wind to 100%. So we have a lot of faith in this US market. I think it is a huge market for growth and opportunity, still continues to be, and we look forward to working bi-coastal to continue to develop the market and make it as successful as it can become.
Great. And last but not least, Sam Eaton from RWE.
Excellent. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm responsible for RWE's offshore business here in the US. For those that aren't familiar with RWE, we've been in the energy industry for about 125 years. We just celebrated our 125th anniversary last fall, and been a global player within the energy industry during that time in a variety of different technologies. But we've been in the offshore wind industry since the very beginning, more than 20 years ago. And today we operate more than 1,000 turbines, primarily in Europe. We came into the US market starting in 2022, and we've been one of the fastest growing in the US market over the last 3 years during that time. I'm excited to acquire leases off the coast of New York and New Jersey, as well as neighbors to Alicia and the Vineyard Wind team off of Humboldt County, as well as recently acquiring a lease in the Gulf of Mexico to begin those efforts. For me, the 3 highlights I would really point to over the last year as many have said, has been the work and the progress that so many in this room have contributed to in order to see California take the next steps to make floating offshore wind happen, including the passage of AB 1373, as well as the work that was mentioned on getting the port grant that so many of us worked together on up in Humboldt County. That really is awe-inspiring to see a state put so much momentum behind the industry so quickly, but it is the first step that we need to take. The second highlight that I would note on is really getting to know the Humboldt community. Our teams have been engaged up there for more than 100 different contacts with the local community, the tribal nations, and other members of the towns there to better understand what is important to those communities. And that's critical to be able to set up a project that's going to be successful. And ultimately what we hope, I think all of us hope on this stage, is an industry for California. And the third, I will just give a little teaser to, but I think there's going to be some great announcements that all of us have over the course of this afternoon as well as tomorrow that really set the stage for some of the progress that the team has made over the last year. And very excited to see those announcements starting to roll out.
Ooh, that's quite a tease. Can't wait. Okay, well, thank you so much for that. And we're going to dive into those topics. I will say that we're going to touch on procurement. We're going to touch on ports. We're going to touch on people in terms of stakeholders and tribes and bringing the public along with us. And we're also going to talk about transmission as well. And so I just want to note before we get started, these are all areas of equal importance. These are the things that really are going to need to be undertaken by everybody in this room. So I don't want anyone to think that the order of these is somehow reflective of their importance. But first, we'll start with procurement. And of course, as you've all said, one of the highlights of this past year has been the movement to establish a central procurement tool. And so, you know, if you could sort of, why has this been so important? So if I'm going to start with Martin, why is this so important? And most importantly, what's next? What needs to happen next to get to that next level?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie, and you're right. We need all of these pieces in the puzzle to be able to move forward with offshore winds. But procurement is one of those pieces which is equally essential because it's our route to market. It's our ability to sell the electricity we generate and generate the revenues. And we really need that to give ourselves the mandate to invest these large capex that's needed to move on to construction and operation. So it's critical that we have that in place and we have the predictability and visibility for that. So I tend to see there's sort of three key stages in project development for us in Equinor. It's securing a lease, it's securing the consents and permits to be allowed to build, and then it's securing the contracts for offtake. But you can't build a project without any of those, but that last one is critical, and knowing about that procurement piece will also set the pace and the level of investment for the first two. So it is critically important we get that right. I think AB 1373 was a really important step. That set the mandate for the state to procure for offshore wind. And then the PUC in April made it clear that offshore wind was an eligible resource for that, which is great. But really the next steps are really important and really critical to get the industry going. And that's the needs assessment, where we think it's incredibly important that needs assessment recognises the need for 10 gigawatts of offshore wind development and procurement. We need to be bold at that type of scale to really get the investment needed in this industry to meet the 10 gigawatts by 2035 time horizons. That 10 gigawatts is consistent with what all of our combined lease areas can deliver. And it's also consistent with a sizable pipeline of projects that will really drive that investment from supply chain, ports, transmission, and us as developers. And it will also be an attractive for future leases that come out to really attract new investment in those areas. So we're keen to see that 10 gigawatts come forward. And we also want to see that predictability and visibility of when those offtake solicitations will be, how often, what type of volumes, so that we can all plan and adjust our development processes accordingly.
That's super helpful. So the needs assessment establishing the volume and the predictability and the certainty of the sort of when and how. Beyond those two things, what over the long term? You know, we've obviously seen the East Coast markets play out over the long term. How, over the long term, can California ensure that the state remains successful in procurement beyond those initial pieces? I don't want to look too far into the future, but obviously we have a market back in the East. Is there anything that we need to do differently here in California? And I'll just open up for whoever. And Alicia, you coming from the East Coast, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you may have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and we do have some lessons to learn from how procurements have advanced on the East Coast. And I think one of the key takeaways from my perspective, and just a brief note on personal background, I also worked at NYSERDA in New York, where we were the procuring entity. So I certainly have seen this from both sides. And I think one of the lessons that we've learned, candidly, a little bit the hard way, as offshore wind has progressed on the East Coast, is the need for flexibility. So it's super important, as Martin said, to send the high-level investment signal to catalyze a lot of things. One is obviously investment from our companies, our shareholders, and the like. But it also catalyzes, collective action at the state level, at the local level. Everyone has that view. But we are talking about very long delivery times, ultimately, to get from procurement to project construction. So thinking about ways we can build flexibility for projects to make adjustments as they progress post, award of a procurement, I think is one of the things that's really critical. And the value of sending that signal now, just building on what Martin said, I think is really, evident in thinking about the presentation we just saw from Chair Hochschild. And, California's putting together a truly world-leading portfolio of clean energy efforts. And we do want to make sure that we can define, the parameters of how offshore wind will fit into that, how, what the benefits that offshore wind will bring that will complement the rest of the state's effort to decarbonize the electric grid in terms of reliability and, dealing with obviously some of the challenges of solar in the duck curve and getting to a diversified portfolio of clean energy resources. We need to put all those pieces together so that we can all, plan accordingly, again, at the, both at, from the private side as well as the public side, as well as stakeholders and others.
Right, great.
Sure, Michael. I think last year when we were here, I said that California was like a belief system. When you go to present and you go to your committees and you ask for a couple of $100 million to buy a lease or more, you usually have to explain how you're going to get a return on your investment and all that fun stuff that people like us have to deal with. When we went to talk about California, it really there was nothing particularly stable. It was more about, whether it was procurement, ports, permitting, transmission. There was a number of things that the ultimate underlying statement was California will get it right because they want to do this and here are the pathways. I think the procurement was just half a check in a box. It's a huge half check, and now I think we need to complete that by, making sure that we get the needs assessment for 10 gigawatts. The other thing for a successful procurement are the two things I would suggest. One is know what you want to buy. Green electrons can sometimes be enough. Understand what other parts, what do you want from the developers, and be very clear about it and have a clear process, and try not to triangulate, because I always think when you're assessing projects, you've got price, you've got viability, and I don't mean maybe deliverability, pathway, can you meet the COD, and then economic development, and we need to make sure that we balance those as much as possible. And if there's any lesson we can take from the East Coast, it has to be that minimizing the time from securing offtake to FID on a project is going to be critical to the success of anything. And the FID for these projects is a long way away, but we need to create a pathway to make sure that all of us developers can continue to invest and continue to progress permitting, transmission, so that we're closer to FID when we bid than we are now, and we can continue to take those steps so that we can bid with certainty, because at the end of the day, certainty is critical to delivering price and the goals of these projects.
Dan and then Sam.
Yeah, sorry. I'd just like to reiterate what our panelists have said so far. That 10 gigawatt target is very important for us on the procurement side. It is the catalyst that then begins to provide that incentive to do investment, through the procurement mechanism, secure the transmission planning path and really work through those early decisions that allow, opening up of the checkbook, say, to allow some of that development to begin to take place. There's so many pieces that are critical. Invenergy, has been developing projects in the U.S. for 25 years. We've got 30 gigawatts of projects that are operating now, and we're developing on both coasts. And that procurement mechanism or the revenue proposition is so critical to moving forward on some of these decisions. The flexibility, because these projects are very long lead projects and we require procurement many years in advance, and the orders of magnitude of costs that are going out our investment doors before FID are significant. So, the planning and getting all those pieces to match up in the puzzle is a significant effort, and the procurement is really that catalyst that begins that.
Yeah. Last word on procurement.
Yeah, I certainly agree with what's been mentioned about flexibility and simplicity and focusing on what we want to get out of the procurement so that we don't end up in a situation where we're trying to do too much too early that effectively blocks the start of the industry. But there's one important point that we haven't talked about in that 10 gigawatt signal, and that's the importance of being able to amortize cost for the supply chain over a long pipeline of projects. And that translates into lower costs for customers here in California as well. And if we try to do this instead by ones and twos, small projects, small one-off awards, the supply chain will try to amortize their investments over just those individual projects, and this cost will be much higher.
Yeah, okay, super. So moving on to transmission. So the CAISO has made some moves in offshore wind in this last year. And so I'll just ask and maybe start with Sam. What have you been most gratified to see, but what needs to happen now?
Yeah. Well, certainly very happy to see the support coming from California and the California ISO with the recent transmission plan to build additional infrastructure into the North Coast. And for those in the room that have been to the North Coast or live on the North Coast, they know that for so long, that region has struggled to get electrical capacity into the region to support its own economic growth, absent what we're talking about here with floating offshore wind. And this is the right first step of multiple billions of dollars of investment that are required to create that pathway to transmission capacity into the North Coast. And just as importantly, to create a pathway for the clean energy from the floating offshore wind farms to come ashore and ultimately to other demand centers as well. But it's very important that we continue to look forward to what the industry could be on the North Coast and the number of leases that are available over the coming years to be able to build a real critical mass of an industry. And that's going to require significant investment that sure is related to offshore wind when we talk about it today, but it has ancillary benefits to the local community of providing that electrical capacity for other needs and helping to connect the community to the electrical grid. Just as importantly, though, this isn't an offshore wind-specific conversation. We can't have the energy transition without transmission, and every technology that's being discussed around today and other forums to make that transition happen are going to require very substantial investments in transmission. Then you ask the question, then what's the cost of doing nothing, or the cost of inaction? You quickly find out that it swamps the cost or the investment of the transmission that's required to make this happen.
Yeah. Any other, Martin?
Yeah, I think from the Central Coast perspective, I think there tends to be a bit of an assumption that we're all connecting to Diablo Canyon because it's a big area and the nuclear power station's decommissioning. But in reality, we've got 6 gigawatts combined in the Central Coast, which is 3 Diablo Canyons. And so what we really need is that investment in the transmission in that area to ensure that the offshore wind that we're providing to meet that demand at the peak times is getting down to that high demand load center in the LA basin. So for us, it is critical that that we have those volumes to 10 gigawatts in this needs assessment so that it can trigger that investment in the transmission and take that away from the project by project upgrade of the grid, which ultimately comes into the generation costs. And we do see that if that is done on a strategic level, then it takes that transmission away from the generation costs, it puts it into a fixed charge, and then what we produce is what we produce, and it's something that gets spread out across the state in terms of cost and not put on the developers and the ultimate cost of energy.
Yeah, I mean,
Alicia, and then you. Yeah.
Yeah, no,
No, no.
I really like the way Sam framed the sort of the cost of inaction, and I do think, you know, maybe to put a slightly finer point on it, you know, again, to use the analogy of what California can learn from the East Coast, I think in this case, you know, we really underinvested and under-considered transmission needs on the East Coast build-out of offshore wind, I would say. It sort of came, you know, after we were sort of far down the field with a number of projects and still, frankly, you know, have a lot of work to do on the East Coast on that topic. So I do give California, the CPUC, CAISO, a ton of credit for, you know, recognizing that this is going to be more cost effective and better for California energy consumers to do this planning now. And then the only other sort of, you know, footnote to that, and it is biting off, you know, a huge project with lots of complexity, is that I don't want to see lost either is a role for serving the local community. Again, you know, we're up in Humboldt with RWE and making sure that transmission planning also takes into account the opportunity for the local community to benefit from those investments as well.
Yeah. Dan.
Yeah, I was just going to highlight for the Central Coast, we've seen in our other project in New Jersey, there was a planning process that took into account the transmission upgrades and basically provided a place to plug in, you know, for our facility there. And that planning is instrumental in getting the investments moving forward. We are encouraged by this, you know, what the state has done in the North Lease. We would like to see something similar occur in the Central Coast. And, you know, these transmission upgrades that will happen, you know, are not only for the generation resources that we're looking to build, they ultimately provide a benefit for the entire state. This allows electrons to move from different locations and will help facilitate, you know, an infrastructure that needs upgrades. And so, you know, our generation resources will help provide that little spark to get the investment going, but continuing to have the vision of incorporating the 10 gigawatts of our leases and how that transmission planning is occurring, and to really kick it off early, because transmission, as we all know, takes a long time to develop, plan, and then build. And so we want to encourage the state to continue to do that.
Excellent.
Can
Michael?
we come at it from a slightly different angle. We're very fortunate, due to the hard work carried out by our team in advance of the lease auction, that we actually have a signed interconnection agreement at Diablo Canyon. But it goes back to Sam's comment earlier on about procurement and supply chain and everything like that. You know, we do have access to grid by 2030, but one individual project is not going to make sense. We have to have a transmission plan that can at least take 10, 12, 14 gigawatts of offshore wind and truly deliver those projects and give us a pathway, because if not, we're never going to be able to deliver our individual project, because you're not going to make the investments in ports or the supply chain to deliver these huge projects for one connected project. So we need a plan. We need, we need a clear vision for transmission for a number of projects to come online sequentially so that we can meet the needs of California. And I mean, I watched David's presentation before we came in. California is doing a huge amount on the demand side. You know, if electric vehicles are now 25% of new cars sold, and that's only increasing, we need to find ways to plug it in, and so that Californians can have confidence that when they are plugging it in and they are, charging their car, that they're charging it with green electrons, and make sure that we're not, so we want to be part of that energy mix and want to make sure that we're supporting it.
So I'm going to move from route to market to some of the really important infrastructure for offshore wind. And I'm going to start with what's near and dear to my heart these days, and that's the public support. So turn forward, for those of you here who don't know, we were founded on the premise that for offshore wind to scale and succeed at the scale that can be a real climate solution, it needs a whole heck of a lot more public support. And so what's really exciting about in California is not only the state's ambition and requirement to make sure that, we really, offshore wind is done in a way that is very stakeholder forward. But you guys have all been engaged in some really exciting work over this past year. And so I wanted to turn to that and ask you, what have you been working on? What is it that needs to happen from your own perspective, but also, with advocates with the state? And so I'll start with Dan.
All right. Yeah. In developing a project, it's very important to have engagement with the community. That community, for these projects is large. We reach out to many different aspects. We have the tribal engagement, we have the local community, we have the fisheries, and at state and local level. So those are very important. I will highlight one of our first hires in California was around engagement with the local community, and that is a activity that Invenergy takes very important. To be successful on these projects, we're going to be in that community for 20, 30 years, 40 years on some of these projects. So we want to make sure that we're engaging, communicating around what the project looks like and how people can get involved. We are happy to announce for our Even Keel Wind project that we recently received acceptance on funding for the tribal engagement. We're going to be working to reach out to each of the tribes to find out how the best way is to provide that funding for that engagement. And I think that's a critical piece in just working through how we can work with the communities around these projects. And very excited for our team to continue to build and to grow as we develop and share more details around the project.
Excellent. Excellent. Anyone else? Sam?
Yeah, just to add to that, it is critically important that we begin infrastructure projects like this by working with the local communities to understand what challenges they face. So often I've seen over the course of my career what can go wrong in project development is the developer shows up and says, here is my completely designed project that I'm planning to build. Let me know how I get my permits, and tries to move forward. What we're trying to do is flip that model on its head and start with a conversation of what works and doesn't work in the community. What are the priorities? What are the things that are non-starters? So that we can build that into a project design over the course of a number of years, a number of conversations and dialogues that happen. That way we create a project that's acceptable to the local community, that works for the local community. And I'm happy to share that we've had more than 300 points of contact just with the fisheries over the course of the last year and a half as we've been building towards that design. Our work with the tribal nations continues as well, with over 100 points of contact that we've made with the tribal nations as we continue that dialogue. And that will just build over the number of years as we continue this discussion.
Yeah. So what's next? What needs to happen next? Alicia?
Sure. So, there's a lot of work ahead of us for sure. And, at Vineyard Offshore, we really do pride ourselves on a community-first approach to development and really informed by a lot of lessons that we've learned through delivering the Vineyard Wind project. But also, we know that it's not one size fits all. And the engagement that we have really does need to be tailored to the unique needs of the communities that we, will be hopefully fortunate enough to call home when we're ultimately able to develop our project. So, there is a lot of, frankly, capacity building that needs to happen, and we are supportive of funding those efforts as we look to advance projects. And again, that's across the same set of partners in this that that others have mentioned. We're certainly eager to build on work that we've done, establishing relationship with tribal nations for other projects. That's going to be critically important and a conversation that isn't always easy, but one that we are committed to approaching in a really open and respectful manner to understand. Again, not this is our project, these are our goals. We need to focus on what are the goals that those tribal nations have for their people and their communities, and how can our project be an accelerant to those goals? And that's really the way we want to look at it.
Super. I'm going to transition then to that second part of the infrastructure, as I mentioned, and that's the ports, the workforce. And maybe, Michael, I'll start with you as the central, because we've heard a little bit about what's happened on the North Coast as it relates to port investment, but maybe on the Central Coast, how are you thinking right now about that port infrastructure? What needs to happen to make sure that sufficient port space is there to be able to build when you're ready?
Yeah, it's the long lead item. If you have to build the port in order to build your project, then you really need to be starting right now. We actually had a delegation from California over to our Moray West project, so it's hard to really see it till you see it. You know, the scale is unbelievable when you've got a port that, you know, we're using 2 ports that are already established in Scotland, one to marshal and install monopiles, the other to marshal and install the turbines, and you've got, you know, racks with monopiles on them that are huge, bigger than this room. You know, you can stand 10 people inside, right, and end to end, and, you know, fit inside it. It's a huge thing, and it's hard to really envisage the size and the scale of what you're going to need in order to deliver, you know, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 turbines at one single time on floaters and get them out there and really move it forward. And I think for us, we're just trying to capture that vision. I think it's important that people understand the scale of what we need, because it is a huge investment in ports. We need to move these ports forward. We need to be ready in order to deliver the capacity that we have. And we really need to see, we need legislators and people in the local community to see the vision of what we need, which is why we're making this engagement, bringing people over to see the ports that we're using, so that they can see truly the type of ports and what we've got and what's fit for purpose and kind of what's not. I do think there's been huge investment in the East Coast. There's a lot of benefits there, but even then the ports are not perfect.
Yeah.
Some of them are imperfect. And I think it's about making sure that we make the right investments, because floating is just that little bit harder. You need a slightly deeper port. You need a little bit more infrastructure. So it needs to be really thought through and really about trying to make sure that these projects come sequentially and move forward.
Right. Well, a lot has gone on in the past year, a lot still to do, and this has been a short but I hope fruitful conversation in terms of a little bit of a snapshot of where we are, what needs to happen next. I will look forward to hopefully being here with all of you next year for the 3rd annual Leaseholders panel and discussion. So if you would, please join me in thanking our panelists this morning. Thanks, everyone.
Perfect.